make the sun burn through the night, and you could make the dead man come alive if you could.
I do want to remind you again of your opportunity to bring to me pressing questions that you come across in the Old Testament. Things that weigh on you, things you're curious about or that you're confused about. And what I want to say is that no question is off limits. That has to do with the Old Testament, the faith of the Old Testament, the accounts of the Old Testament, the incidents, the teaching, the history, the people. Any question is fair, and I want this to be an environment where no one would be looked down on because of something they're struggling over in the Old Testament. Really, and in faith and in Christianity. Because faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the evidence of things not seen. But faith does not mean that there cannot be any question or testing of our faith and our beliefs. So faith is not something that should be used as a way to suppress questions, because then we are forming people to follow their faith as an ideology without it being written on the heart and mind if questions are not allowed. And so, and what I mean by that is I want it to be a safe environment. And as you journey in faith and you come across things, I want you to be able to ask those. You don't have to ask them to me. And it could very well be that there are some things that you're not comfortable asking. That happens. I have had questions in my life in faith and journey with the Lord that I have not been comfortable to ask people at first. Probably most likely because of a fear that I would be looked down upon for my skepticism or my doubt in a certain area, something like that. And that's just normal. But I want you to know that I've been there, and we're all together on this journey of faith, and we have powerful evidences for believing in the Lord and believing in His people, believing in the text. And I want to help you and find together evidences. And so it might not just be having to do with something that you're skeptical about. It might be something that you're troubled by or confused by, or that you just have a question about, like the one we had last Tuesday about where the Egyptians come from. Remember that question? And so in my mind, while we were talking, I went to Cain, and then I hadn't had a chance to think, well, we had to start over with Noah, and then someone proposed, well, it would have come from Ishmael, and then someone else said, now wait a minute, but Hagar was already an Egyptian, so Egyptians didn't come from Israel. So that was wonderful what was happening right there. Without even digging in, we were bringing things together. And so I jumped in there, and I won't always be able to answer them in class. And instead of using that one because it was so quick and simple for a group project in the future, I just went ahead and said, oh, here it is. Let me answer it. And so, for instance, for that one, where did the Egyptians come from? Some of you might have already looked that up. They descended from Noah's son, Ham. He had a son. Remember, Noah cursed Ham's son, Canaan, and in many ways spoke that over Ham and his family. One of Ham's sons was named Egypt. That was his name. And so we find there the beginning of the Egyptian peoples, descended from someone named Egypt. So, boy, that one was quick, huh? And there's the verses right there in Genesis. We just backtrack to Genesis for a moment. All right, so that's what you would call trivia, more of like a trivia, biblical trivial pursuit. Finding little details and facts and elements and items. And then there are bigger things that I'm hoping that some of you will bring to me, having to do with the things in this class. All right? You can email them to me. You can talk to me if you get a chance to catch me, however that may be. And let's go ahead and jump in today to our reading in the book of Exodus. This is Exodus part 2. And we have today Anna, you're on for reading today. If you could turn, Anna, to Exodus chapter 23 and read verses 1 through 19, good and loud, and if you could stand. And before you do that, I want to say to everybody, while Anna's reading this passage from Exodus 23, listen to the text, listen to the instructions that Moses is giving by the command of God for the ordering of their life and society. This is just one section. This is certainly not the only section. I picked one. I went through the later part of Exodus where there are so many things about moral and ritual and civil laws, and I picked this. And I want you to listen and think about, while Anna's reading, things in here that have to do with the thriving of human life. That's what law is intended for, protection and thriving of human life. But things that are timeless, principles that you might catch, things that are timeless. Oh, you know, I can see why the Lord instituted that early in His people. There's a principle there that has remained through the stages of God's plan of revelation and redemption as it has progressed, even though some of the rituals have changed, or even some of the codes and laws. There's a principle there that you feel is timeless. Or maybe there is something you will catch that, no, we don't follow that anymore. Oh, no, I'm sure glad we don't have that law anymore in our society. You might catch those things that were, what I say, were time bound to where the people were at, what God determined was required of them in the society that they were in, and also where they were at as a people. There are some things that we do not keep anymore as a part of moral or civil law. Not just the ritual law that was fulfilled in Christ, but even the moral or civil law. There were things there that were for a time. So I want you to listen to those and think that way while we're listening to the reading of the sacred text. And Anna, if you could stand for us.
So 1 through 19.
1 through 19. And no pressure on you to pull all that out, all that I just said. No pressure on you. You're just reading today. So
Okay.
thank you.
You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall within with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many, so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving it without it, leaving it with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in the lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe lies nearsighted and subverts the cause for those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. For 6 years you shall sow in your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. 3 times in a year you shall keep a feast for me. You shall keep the feast of the unleavened bread, as I command you, and shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of the week. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of the harvest of the first fruits of your labor, and what you sow in the field you shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year. When you gather in from the field and the fruit of your labor, 3 times in the year shall all of your males appear before the Lord. You shall not offend the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my drooping until the morning. The beasts of the first fruits of your ground shall bring you into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk.
Thank you. All right, any thoughts, comments on that? Can you read the text?
There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot. And there's a lot more in what comes before and after. And you get into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Whoo! Yeah, Sean.
Is there like a good way to like distinguish like what we should keep in the Old Testament law with today, like what we should observe? I guess this is kind of something you have to like wade through yourself, or is there like civil law? And that's a weighted question. Maybe that's
Yeah,
what it is.
and that's the great challenge of people who pursue law and go into the field of law, is you quickly find that the foundations of national law in Western civilization and the laws of the land are biblical in their foundation, whether people like that or not. And that has caused the thriving of human life, not perfectly, but because people aren't perfect. And they find that foundation, but then the question becomes, issues that are brought up in Exodus and elsewhere, what kind of wrong or crime is grounds for capital punishment, execution? What we hold to now in society is very different than what Moses commanded to the people. Some ways there's some similarities, but in some ways it's very different. The transgression of certain moral boundaries was grounds for execution in the Old Testament peoples. And so someone along the way made the determination that that does not stand anymore. That's not necessary. That's not God's plan. That's not what He's doing with our people here. But you have, we'll look at this in some of the material today. You have three areas of the law, Old Testament law. You have the moral law, morality. Then you have the civic law, societal things having to do with our relationship with each other. And then you have the ritual or spiritual law having to do with our relationship with God, although that also is the moral law, has to do with relationship to each other and God. Civil law is relationship to each other. And then the ritual and spiritual laws has to do with our relationship to God. So you have those three arenas. Did you catch those? Civil, moral, civil, and ritual, or spiritual, that are commanded, and much of it in great detail. So there's a lot to sort through, Sean.
Yeah.
Yeah. We know from, for instance, with the festivals, the keeping of the festivals and the commands to keep the festivals, and that if you don't keep the festivals, you will be cut off, you are to be cut off from your people. Paul says in Galatians and elsewhere, to the believers in Christ, you're keeping festivals. What is your problem? There's a change. What is your problem that you have gone back to the old ways? Paul says. Very forcefully. Paul, when he gets on issues of legalism, he gets sarcastic and bam, pounding the podium, you know. And yet here, there's a reason for a new people, a fragile people, a wandering people that God is forming into a nation of people that will bring in His deliverer and eventually be consummated eternally as a people, which is where we're in between. But there's a reason for these things. I don't have the answer to all of those reasons why here and now at this time, although there are some, we know, but then there's also a reason that some of them are no longer followed. So, but I don't know of a rule, Sean, that we can use. That's a great question. Yeah, our curiosity says that way. Who says, who was to say that we're not gonna follow this? Especially when you get commands that say, from now on, forevermore, you will keep this feast. Was that meant to be literal forevermore? Or was that a statement, a figure of speech to say, as long as we are walking with God in this way, and this is his command for us, we will keep it? Because Jesus clearly violated some of the laws. And boy, did people get angry at him for that. He clearly violated. It was like he would set the stage on purpose and heal on the Sabbath. He would get up and do the work of ministry and healing on the Sabbath on purpose. And the religious leaders, they become furious. So there's a lot in here. And it starts to become much more interesting than when you just first, say, I just have to learn all this stuff, right?
Cause I know, I know there's a strain of like Hebraic roots Christianity where they are and holding the feast again, and it's just kind of like because I know that like in the New Testament I think there is a place where it says, in this he declared all foods clean, or like just something like the leaving the land rest valid for like the 7th year and having 50. So I was just like curious about those things, and it's probably some things that I need to like look into for myself. It's interesting.
Yeah, and then we find out later though with technology that they didn't have, that's the best thing for soil. And we find other things like science and biology reveals to us that if you don't rest and stop your hard work once a week and cease and give yourself rest, it's like you're taking years off your life because of what happens to what your adrenal system does to you, to your heart and your nervous system. And biologically, it's best to rest. And here you have this ancient command when they weren't able to study those kinds of things and the intricacy of the human body. Yeah, Jacob.
I would say like a good way to determine which laws from the Old Testament were still applicable to us today, like you said, the moral, the civil, and the ritual or spiritual. I would say that certain moral laws spill over into the civil law arena, whereas civil laws don't spill over into the morality area. Things are moral or immoral because of what God says to us, but things are uncivil or civil won't affect the morality of the situation that you're in.
Good point. Yeah. Okay.
On what Sean was saying, or what you were saying about that, during the French Revolution, they decided to go to a 10-day week and only had a day of rest every 10 days. And they all were falling over dead in the streets.
Exhaustion. Interesting.
That's
history I didn't know.
God knew just how long.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, like circumcision on the 8th day. They didn't know that blood clots best after birth on the 8th day. They didn't know those things. Yes.
As far as like the Sabbath and everything, even though we're not under the law, like, don't you think it's possible, or don't you think that God created us that way so that we would kind of be forced to have to rest in Him at least every once in a while?
I sure do. I sure do. The spiritual benefit of ceasing for a day is profound. It's like, remember we were talking about wilderness. God puts leaders in a wilderness to test them. The simple command, which was a command in law in the Old Testament, now it's a part of our spiritual rhythm and learning to rest in the Lord, of taking a day to rest every week. It's like a mini wilderness. If we really stop, Hannah, if we really stop computer, like in our home, what we do is when it's ideal, we've kind of, with the start of the school year here, we've gotten a little messier with it. But we're under grace. On our day of Sabbath rest as a family, which can be, we just pick the best day for us in the week. We take our devices, like our smartphones and my kids' Kindles and all that stuff, and we put them in a basket to say, we're not going there on this day. We're going to spend time with each other and with God. And, you know, sure, some days the kids are like, oh, you know, I just want to play video games, whatever it might be. And even my wife and I sometimes will say, oh boy, I know those emails are piling up today, you know, it starts. But the benefits of really doing that just come out immediately. We have time with each other, we have time with the Lord. Your heart rate is slower when you're not doing all those things and your body is resting. And it's easier to meditate on the Lord, it's easier to pray. And we don't have usually we don't set up to gatherings with the kids with their friends and things on that day. We just try to, and we found that is such a time of spiritual renewal. And totally see that in the ancient law, that God was doing that for his people. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, because as far as like what Sean was talking about with the grassroots, like Jewish people, like the Christians going back to the Jewish roots. My sister, my older sister, and her husband are doing that, and they observe the Sabbath, and be kosher and like all those things. And I've gone to their house on the Sabbath and like studied the Torah portion, which is like this with them, and it's like such a blessing.
Yeah, yeah. I would say we have freedom to recreate traditions, but we're under grace, so there's no requirement from God that we would do that. But it's his best wisdom.
And I don't think they're doing it legalistically. They just feel like that's where God is calling them, and they feel like they've received tremendous blessing. Like it's not legalistic to them at all. It's just like the way that's best to them. Like they just feel so blessed.
Yeah, it's life to them. Yeah. And now some people who would struggle, let's say there's a believer that's really struggling with condemnation or legalism, relating to God, not really free in their mind of what it means to be right with God through Christ. It probably would be best for them not to have codes and strict discipline put on them like that, because it would just add to their, so it's, you know, it also depends on where people are at. But the simple wisdom of saying, hey, we were meant to stop for a day, at least that part, you're just gonna suffer if you don't. But the rhythms of Sabbath spirituality is a rhythm to get us into a slower mode. Because like what even in Israel, what they still do, so much of Israel, you go to Israel on the Sabbath, it's like I've never been there, I've just heard and read about it, like the streets quiet down, not totally, but like it was almost like the whole land goes dead for a day, just, and that's so much better than what we have. Yeah, I hate it when on our Sunday when we have to do all of our family shopping for the week on Sunday. I hate that. Because then we're just it's the worst, I'm more tired on Sunday night than any other day of the week. When we're just, you know, Walmart's like the size of a football field, and you're going through that thing. Yeah, so good, yeah.
A lot of times we changed our Sabbath from Sunday to Saturday, because Sunday is just so busy.
Yeah, right. That's what, and we've run into that now that we're helping out with the church plant. Sometimes the responsibilities we have will make Sunday, we'll say, well, we need to do something different here. So we have to juggle that. Yeah, Dave.
There's that scripture in Colossians where Paul says, let no man judge you like with a feast day or a new moon or a Sabbath.
Or a Sabbath.
So I think like, I know there's like a place out in Texas where, you know, like they keep the Saturday Sabbath and the feast days, but I think like you can do that if you wanted to, like, but if you start saying, well, if you don't do that, you're not a true follower.
Legalism.
So yeah, so it has to be your own, just like, well, if that works for you, then that's your own,
Yeah, and by observing though, what happens is if you observe, kind of jump in and swim a little with the ancient traditions of our heritage as a Judeo-Christian believers, they will be so enriching, and the discovery and the what was so tangible about some of those things will be enriching. Like what monastic spirituality has done for me. when I have spent time, I've never been a monk, but when I have spent time on retreats at a monastery, the rhythms of, well, I can't say I've participated in the 2:30 a.m. When they get up for their first part of the day. That's when their day begins, it's like 2:30. They go to bed at 7 and get up at 2:30. I was like, well, that part I'll probably not do. Maybe I should sometime though. By jumping in and swimming some, it was very enriching and really, really increased just my sense of grounding in the Lord and in His people. So, okay, well, we need to move along here. Great comments and great thoughts there. Let's go back to Exodus 12, and I have here a slide straight from Professor Paul Edwards' study on the plagues and the gods of Egypt. How the plagues, the 10 plagues, and there's 9 of them here, are connected to the faith of the Egyptian people. Possibilities. How it was connected to the beliefs of the Egyptians when the plagues happened, and what that would have, what that very likely could have communicated to the Pharaoh and to the Egyptian people when the plague occurred. And I want to first read to you Exodus 12:12. This is the word of the Lord to Moses. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn. You remember which plague that is, right? That's the last plague, the 10th. Both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So you see the connection there. God was judging the Egyptians and Pharaoh for their wickedness and their oppression of his people. But he was also bringing judgment upon the gods of Egypt, the demonic powers. And when I say something like that, that's full of assumptions from the perspective of our faith, but I think you're there. The powers and the spirituality of the Egyptian people, he was bringing judgment on them. Exodus 12:12. And so let's look at that here. Just quickly, we have the Nile being turned to blood, and there is a possible connection with an Egyptian deity, Khnum, who was a guardian, who was believed to be a supernatural guardian of the Nile. And then you have some others here. Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, and Osiris, having to do with something with the Nile being a bloodstream of the people. So with the Nile turning to blood, there was a shocking connection for the Egyptian people. The frogs, the plague of the frogs. Remember the plague of the frogs? What happened with that? It wasn't just like a couple cute frogs in the morning on the doorstep, kind of a thing. Oh, look! And the scriptures there are here. It was overwhelming. Frogs were everywhere in their beds, in their cups, in their bowls, in the dishes. And you have this Egyptian god, Hecht, who was embodied in the form, in their tradition, of a frog, and had to do with resurrection in the afterlife. And then you have gnats, the plague of gnats. And you have the Egyptian god Set, who was the god of the desert, and they came in from the desert. So it was like their own god was coming after them. And he was not, that god was not what they thought it was. He was coming after them and bringing destruction. You had the flies. And you have this Egyptian deity, Uwatchet, who was represented by a fly. Not a very powerful deity, don't you think so? Yeah, not real powerful. Yes, Grace.
It's really interesting because isn't there a connection between flies and Beelzebub? Because doesn't Beelzebub mean Lord of the Flies or something like that?
That sounds correct, and I'm not sure. That sounds, yeah, that's great, Grace. Yeah, great. Great point. And then thank you. Then the plague on the cattle. was very important to them, the animals and what they represented. Hathor, the mother goddess, who was embodied in the form of a cow. And then you had some other there that were bulls and having to do with fertility. And they were sacred. Cows, sacred animals. So the plague of the cows, which was here, but then also in the last plague. Firstborn sons and cattle were struck down in the 10th plague. Sometimes we forget about the cattle part. The boils on their skin and their inability to be healthy as a people and suffer with these horrible boils. We have this here, Imhotep, the god of medicine, the Egyptian god of medicine, and another goddess here over disease. So everything was failing. It was, their system of belief was failing in front of them. The hail, Nut, the sky goddess, was very angry at them, you could say, from their perspective. But they were hearing that this was the God of the Jews who was overpowering. So they were making that connection, at least those that heard. The worst hailstorm that ever happened, Moses predicted it would be the worst that anyone had ever seen. From the time of Egypt's beginning all the way to the future, never again would there be a hailstorm like that. Locusts, Isis, the goddess of life, or Isis, and Seth, the protector of the crops, and the plague of darkness. And we have these various deities here having to do with sun gods, Ra, and then the other names there, sun gods, deities in the sky and in the universe. So we see here that God is bringing, this is the connection, this is a great study here that Professor Edwards gives, the connection with Exodus 12:12, judging Pharaoh and the people and judging the gods of Egypt. How did Pharaoh and Egypt respond to the word of the Lord and to the plagues? What was the response? We are told repeatedly in the text that Pharaoh... An interesting thing is this comes up, at least in these places that I have put here for you, is that it is God himself who has hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's not just Pharaoh and his hatred and his fear, although he was clearly driven by fear. But it is God himself who has hardened Pharaoh's heart so as to bring the armies of Egypt to destruction and to make his name known, that they would know that he is the Lord. That's a statement that comes up. And then they will know that I am the Lord. And there are some passages there where we get a direct statement that it was the Lord that hardened Pharaoh's heart. Interesting. Elijah.
Can you explain that more why he actually hardened his heart? That was like confusing me. I was like, wait, why is this hardened his heart?
Yeah. Yeah, right. Predestination. God was predestining here, you could say, or at least not necessarily predestining, because who knows if it was Pharaoh's wickedness that God looked at him and he said, hands off. Pharaoh got to a point and he said, that's it. You know, I'm just speaking theoretically from God's mindset. That's it. You are so wicked. You've passed the point of no return. I'm going to harden your heart. You're done for, and I'm going to use your wickedness to make my glory known and to deliver my people. Whatever that was, or if he predetermined from long ago that Pharaoh would be that way, what we get from the text is that he coerced Pharaoh into hardness. It was him that did it. The text says that he wanted the people to know that he was Lord. Jacob talked about that last time. He wanted the people to know that his name, that he's the one true God. He wanted to deliver his people. And so Pharaoh became a tool in his hand. As cruel as it seems when we're in this arena of thinking about it this way, Elijah, Pharaoh became a tool in God's hand to manipulate his own people and armies to bring about God's desired ends.
He kind of used to turn his armies against him.
Against God and against his people.
Yeah.
Against God's people.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and that brings this up, the ways of God, and we say, wow, there's some big things there in our mind when we think about the Lord. Yeah, Brandon.
Is there any maybe examples of this like in the New Testament, sort of like the same thing where God hardens his heart?
Romans talks about
Like would he do that today, you think?
I would, the way I see it is certain people, a select number of people, whose wickedness and opposition to God and godliness or God's people reaches a certain point. I would say I'm comfortable with believing that there are those that God sees that they've passed the point of no return, and their destruction is something that he is able to use for his purposes. So that's how I look at that, though. I look at it from a perspective first of mercy and grace and openness, that God lets people set their direction, and then he looks at them, and once they've crossed past the point of no return, which no one can determine that except God himself, once they've passed the point of no return. They have reached a point where God knows they are not going to turn back. They will not turn to the Lord. I would say that there are some, but then that doesn't answer the question about being predestined to be that way. And to that question, are there some that he determined beforehand that all of that would happen in their lives? What I believe is that there are some people in some circumstances that God predestines and foreordains to happen in a certain way because they have to do with, they are critical to his plan for the world and his plan of redemption. But then I would say all around that there are many things that he remains open to in letting people decide how they're going to live their lives. That's where I stand on the issue of what does he control and what does he not control. But we don't know from this text here that he's determined that that would happen all along, but we know that at this point, God is an agent, is an outside agent coercing the heart of Pharaoh to hardness. Pretty scary. Yeah. I saw another hand. Sean.
I don't know, I have the verse here in Romans 17. I don't know if there's like any insight to it, but it says, "For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." And then it says about the potter. I think it's pretty familiar to us.
Yeah, that's one of the key passages that speaks to that on the teaching in this theological point. So some of that we'll have to save. I'll have to have you save until your theology classes, where you'll be able to talk more in depth about that. So, but you've got some great questions to prime the pump when you're in those classes, don't you? Yeah. Okay. So when Moses, so we know Pharaoh continually hardened his heart. Here's a different moment. When Moses prophesies a great hailstorm, the seventh plague, the worst storm they've ever seen, some of Pharaoh's officials heed the word. Pharaoh, listen to him. Do what he says. We're all going to die. So there was a change of heart, you could say, in some of them. Pharaoh's, over and over again, Pharaoh's apparent confessions and repentance turn out to be completely false and empty. And there's one of the instances in chapter 9, 27 to 28. Later on, Pharaoh's officials counsel Pharaoh to listen to Moses. Again, listen to him. Do what he says. It was a second time. And we know that Pharaoh ultimately refuses until the final plague, and it still wasn't the end. All right, so let's move along here. We have to move quickly through this to the Passover. Very different. What I want to start by saying is the Passover is very different than what 12:12 says in the pass through. In the Lord's passing through of 12:12, chapter 12, verse 12, we have something very different than the Lord's Passover of these passages here in other places. Let me just say, you want to be in the Passover, not in the pass through. right? Who's with me on that one? What's the pass through? The pass through is the terminology that means as he comes passing through, he is passing through to strike down the firstborn of Egypt. So we want to be in the Passover. That's, if we were among God's people, we would want to be those whom are told a promise that if they do such and such, they will be passed over. Who knows what the such and such is? Who can recall the stipulations of the Passover? Alan?
Lamb's blood on the door, top of the door.
Mm-hmm. Yep. They were to take a lamb or a goat, and they were to sacrifice, and they were to smear the blood on the lintel, the top, and then on the doorposts. And the sacrificial blood would be a sign to the Lord, to the Spirit of the Lord, as he passed through, warring against the Egyptians. These are my people. And we say, well, doesn't he already know they're his people? He's God. He goes by the door. He doesn't have to open the door and look in there and say who's in the door. Does God have to do that? No. God has covenanted with his people. He has established a way of relating to his people who have fallen and who are marked by sin, and who cannot be in his presence without that sin being dealt with. And the marking that he has made in the covenant is in the sacrifice of animals for his Old Testament people. So when they slew the goat or the lamb and they smeared the blood, it was a sign. These are the people who are keeping my covenant. And they would be passed over. What else, besides the lamb or the goat, what else was a command for the night of the Passover? Hannah?
When they were eating, they had
Mhm.
to eat like with their sandals on and the staff in their hand,
Mm-hmm.
like they were ready to go.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. They were like anticipating bolting out the door while they were eating. And so they were to be ready because they were going to be hurried in a few moments to leave the land. Okay, and so they were, it's right here, they were to cook bread in haste without yeast. The reason being is that the command of God would be, the command of God to cook the bread without yeast is so that they would be fed and prepared for their hurried journey, and they did not have the time that it would take for yeast, for the rising effect of yeast in the dough, so as to be cooked without yeast, which became a very important part of their commemoration of the Passover when they're celebrating it later, which Moses intersperses here. We'll look at that real quickly. So the Lord promised Moses that the blood of the door frames of their homes would be a sign to him, and he would pass over them while he judges Egypt. They would not harm them. I want to look, even though it's going to hurry us on some of the other points here in Exodus, I want to look at this with you. Matthew 26, our connection to the New Testament, where we find, and I am just giving you little tidbits here, even in Exodus, of where the new covenant is hidden in the Old and in the accounts of the people of God in the Old Testament. Matthew 26, 17 to 19. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and this is the feast that they're commanded to keep to commemorate the Passover. On the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, 'The teacher says, my appointed time is near. I am going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. And then I want to jump to verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." See the connection. The bread made in haste, eaten in the Passover, and the Lord sharing in the Passover with his disciples in naming the bread as a symbol of his own body. Verse 27, then he took the cup and gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Then 1 Peter 1, 18 to 20, we get Peter's teaching on this. 1 Peter 1, 18 to 20. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. And so we see here just one place where Jesus is named the sacrificial lamb. He's the lamb that God used to fulfill his requirements for passing over judgment on his people. You see the connection. It's very profound. Festival of unleavened bread. We get this mix in here, you could say, in chapter 12. Moses intersperses, when he wrote this, the instructions for the later festival in the midst of his account of the Passover for their commemoration. Festival of unleavened bread symbolized and memorialized the hurry in which the Israelites were to prepare for their departure from Egypt. It was intended to keep the memory of the event alive in the minds of future generations. That's clear. It says that specifically for their children. All leaven was to be cleansed from the house in order to recall the hurried baking of bread without the time required for the rising effect of yeast. Okay, the last plague and the Exodus. God had promised that they will receive the spoils of Egypt as they leave. And we see here again partial fulfillment of his promise to Abraham, that his people would be blessed. We see a partial fulfillment as they're leaving the land. This terrified and angry and grieving people, the Egyptians, are giving them all of these treasures and gifts, and as they're saying, "Get out of here," them to come back, they pour on them their riches, their loot, you could say. And the people leave with the spoils of Egypt. Moses, before this, Moses prophesies that this is going to happen, that they're going to leave with the spoils of Egypt. He also prophesies to Pharaoh that the firstborn humans and cattle will all die. And then in chapter 12, 29 to 30, Moses records for us that the Lord passes through the land during the night, killing all of the firstborn sons and cattle. Pharaoh finally releases Moses and the Israelites. They depart, gathering the spoils as they go. And we get here a turning point, but we're not all the way there yet in God's intentions. God had delivered his people from the land of Egypt, but he had not yet brought down Pharaoh and his army. It's a very important moment there of turning, but we're not all the way. Yeah?
Just wondering, the last plague, because like all the other 9 plagues were against a god, so to speak. The last plague, was it against anything? Or because I know, I can't remember right now if it was like Pharaoh or Moses were the ones who like said, like kind of like declare the last plague, but.
Yeah.
But what, the last plague, was it against anything like that or?
Oh yeah.
What?
Oh yeah.
Well, I was just
Here.
gonna add to that, because like I know like the Egyptians, just from studying history, they always believed that the pharaoh was a god himself, and if his son died, then it would be against him himself, like a disrespecting to him as a god, that his son would be killed.
That's it.
So,
Yeah, it was the biggest one of all, Elijah. For the Egyptians, Pharaoh was God. And so for his heir to be killed was like the major final blow to their visible living deity in their midst. The loss and the crush and the humiliation of that was, extreme. So absolutely, it was connected. It was like the last one and the biggest one. Yeah. Yeah, glad you asked. So we have to move through this very quickly. The Lord leads the people supernaturally with a pillar of cloud during the day and fire at night. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 9, we find an interesting note here that by the command of God, the people were to camp within view of Pharaoh. This was on purpose. To encamp themselves within sight range of Pharaoh to incite Pharaoh to chase them down. God has in mind to trap and kill the army of Egypt. Very interesting note there in the account that this was done on purpose by the command of God. He wanted Pharaoh, he still wanted Pharaoh to have to deal with these people, even after they were gone. And so Pharaoh comes after them during the night. The pillar moves between Egypt and Israel, the Israelite people. And while that's going on, the Israelites pass through the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. It may not be the large, giant Red Sea that you see on the map. It's a translation issue. It could be the Sea of Reeds, which was a different spot north of there. The meaning of the Hebrew there. Possibly the Sea of Reeds. But either way, the Lord sent a powerful wind and piled the waters up on either side of them. Regardless of whether it was the giant Red Sea or a huge massive lake, the Sea of Reeds, the water was piled up by a mighty wind and they passed through. Pharaoh is chasing them in his rage, and God releases the water and drowns every last soldier and horse. And the scripture says that the Israelites were able to turn around and see the bodies flopping on the shore in the waves. It was very clear to them that their enemy was dead. Elijah. No, it's all right.
Could you kind of like relate like the waters coming down and like the wickedness of the Egyptian army? Because before Ramses, they like the Israelites had a connection with Egypt. Then when Pharaoh came in, then he made the Israelites slaves. Could you relate like the waters coming on the Egyptian army to the flood of Noah, like wiping out the evilness, the wickedness?
I haven't thought of that connection. I more thought of a later connection when the Lord is angered at the revelry of the people while Moses is up on the mountain and he wants to destroy them all. I thought of that connection, but not that one. Well, I think what jumps off to me first is that just God, it was revealed there, God has power to do whatever he wants to do with nations and armies, and that he is on the side of his people. So that's a good thought, Elijah. So yeah, I'm not making a connection on it. Doesn't mean there isn't one, but yeah. Sean.
I don't know. I just like the thought popped in my head that it could almost be related to like baptism or something. Like God's chosen man is like delivered, and like the sinful man dies. It's a baptism in a sense.
Yeah. And there might be a New Testament reference to that on the baptism. There is for them passing through the water with Moses. But as far as the symbolism of the destruction of Egypt, like you're saying, Sean, I think it's safe to make the connection. If the connection is there of the people passing through the water, And if Paul seems to, with wisdom and with the guidance of the Spirit, in a creative way, use other Old Testament stories to illustrate New Testament principles, you see Paul doing that. I would say that we have license to do just what you're saying there, Elijah, with care and wisdom as we're making those kinds of connections. But there's clearly biblical teaching and themes to say that God deals with wickedness by putting it under. So I want to say, and thank you, Sean. That got me thinking on what is there already. So I'd say it's safe to say, yeah, like an allegory or a metaphor of New Testament life and faith. Okay, he drowns them, and then during their journey, they're exhausted in the desert, and they are becoming deathly dehydrated, and they come to a place called Elim. Have you wondered what the name Elim is for? Why is this place called Elim? Why is it spelled E-L-I-M? It is based upon this passage where God brings his wearied people to a place of refreshing and renewal in him, to rest and be renewed. That's what Elim was. Exodus 15:27. And this is an interesting note here. I like the way that Professor Edwards says this in his book. Through their complaints and doubts, God was gracious and merciful. They were complaining, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. What? Moses, you brought us out here to die. Leave us, shouldn't you have just left? And despite all that, the Lord provides for them, and he gives them miraculous manna in the mornings. And Professor Edwards, he just tells it like it is. He says, God always provides for his children even when they whine. I just like that. Okay, and as they move on, we come into the law, and we see the Lord working through Moses, speaking to Moses and leading Moses to establish a nation. For a people to be established as a people in a nation, they need to be governed. They need to be guided in how they are to live in daily life, not just in being delivered, not just in fighting and struggling, and they have to do those things with their enemies, but in how they are to order their life and order their relationship with God. And so we get the law, and the Lord brings them to the foot of Mount Sinai, 50 days after the Passover, and he reveals his calling for these people. He wants them to be a self-governing people, and so he gives them laws. First gives them the moral law, Exodus 20. Then he gives them the priestly or sacrificial or spiritual, and I usually refer to those as the ritual laws, Exodus and Leviticus. And then he gives them the governmental and the social laws, the civil laws for Israel, Exodus and Deuteronomy. And you'll see big differences in the way, some similarities and some differences in how we use those foundations. And I brought this right out of Professor Edwards' study, the Ten Commandments. We have the first set of commandments, 1 through 4, that have to do directly with our relationship with God. Number 1, no other gods before the Lord. These are paraphrased. Number 2, make no graven image. Do not have physical, tangible idols that are objects of worship or deities in your possession. And we had long conversations about what are the idols of our day. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Keep the Sabbath holy. This was law for them. They were commanded by God in the Old Covenant. They had to keep the Sabbath to relate rightly with God. It was a huge part of their mark and how people knew these are the people of Yahweh. These are the people of Israel because of what they're doing on this time of week. They have the Sabbath. People knew who they were. And then we have the second set of the commandments that have to do with our relationship to each other. Honor your father and mother. Do not take another person's life by murder. It has to do with slaying. It doesn't have to do just with killing, because clearly they were authorized to kill in times of war and in judgments, when judgments were being made about wrongs and violations, but not to murder. The meaning is don't murder. Number 7, don't commit adultery. And the word there in the Hebrew has to do with infidelity of either partner. Number 8, don't steal. Number 9, don't bear false witness or lie. Number 10, don't covet the good things that your neighbor has. His wife, or his possessions, his house. Don't covet the good things. And that is a powerful word there. Earnest desire or lusting after. And those are the two sets, relationship with God and relationship with each other. That's important there. Okay, we get this awful moment here in Exodus 32. The Israelites fall into great sin. Moses and Joshua are up on the mountain in the presence of God. The people become afraid that Moses is dead and he's gone, and now they're left alone in the wilderness. They have no one to lead them. And they freak out and they immediately go back to their familiarity with pagan ways. And they get Aaron to make an idol, a calf idol. And when Moses is coming down, Joshua hears it and he says, it sounds like he hears this loud sound. Listen to the sound of war in the camp. And he says, it's not war. It's the sound of singing. And Moses realizes that they are engaging in pagan revelry, which was very likely like a massive orgy is what they were doing. At least some of the people, is massive orgy around the calf. And so, similar to the frame of mind God had in the time of Noah, God sees the sin of the people and he wants to destroy them. He says, Moses, I can build a nation out of you, Moses. I want to destroy these people. This is an interesting window into God's relationship with his people. Two ways. In the Old Covenant, the harshness of that word. But then what happens when Moses disagrees? And Moses influences God to refrain from destroying his people. Very interesting. Yeah, Jacob.
How could God be influenced by one of his creations?
That's one of the most profound theological questions that we could ever ask.
I immediately thought that can't happen. God can't be influenced. So it made me think that God allowed Moses to think that he was influencing him so Moses could see his mercy.
And that's exactly the point of some who say it doesn't really mean what it says because God controls and predetermines everything. So that is, those would say, and I have to let you go, they would say that's just what is called an anthropomorphism. It is a rendering of the story and interpreting it in such a way that it makes sense on our terms, but God's not really like that. There were those that would say that. And I leave you with the question, is that what's going on there, or was he really influenced by Moses? How's that one? Okay. All right. And so we didn't get to where we were planning on, but that's all right. And that just happens in a survey course. Have a great day.
If you could make the sun burn through